I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Donald Trump unveils sweeping new sanctions on Russia's energy giants, we analyse what recent developments reveal about the shifting power dynamics between Moscow and Washington. We also investigate an alleged Russian war crime in Donetsk and what it exposes about the brutal nature of the fighting there, before exploring why NATO countries continue to pour vast resources into tank production and modernisation.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 23rd of October, 3 years and 243 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Senior Foreign Correspondent, Memphis, and former tank commander, Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. But first, over to Dom for the latest military developments.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Hello, everybody. So today is going to be a day, it seems, of sanctions. But ahead of all that stuff in the European Council, Ukraine's been conducting its own sanctions campaign against Russia. A suspected drone strike last night targeted the Ryazan oil refinery about 150 kilometres southeast of Moscow. Russia says it's shot down 14 Ukrainian drones over the area, and regional governor Pavel Malkov said debris from some of the downed drones had caused a fire at an industrial site without specifying the facility. But if it's the facility that's widely doing the rounds on social media, showing it to be engulfed in flames, it speaks of some pretty dangerous debris. Now, that attack seemed part of a wider aerial bombardment of Russia by Ukraine last night. Moscow says 139 drones targeted 10 regions across Russia, saying 56 were intercepted over Belgorod Oblast, 22 over Bryansk, 21 over Voronezh, 14 over Ryazan, 13 over Rostov, 2 each over Tambov, Volgograd, Oryol and Kaluga, and 1 over Kursk. So that's basically every Russian region between Moscow and Ukraine, kind of spanning out from southwest to southeast, really. Another 4 drones, Russia says, were brought down over occupied Crimea. Now, stick down south, go 150 k's east of the Kerch Bridge, you get to the city of Stavropol. Explosions were reported there last night near a military base. Now, a lot of this reporting comes from Russian media, so there's going to be a health warning on that. However, they are saying that in Stavropol, a woman was killed after sustaining shrapnel wounds from this suspected and reported explosion. They say a baby stroller with an explosive device hidden inside was planted near the military site. This is unnamed sources speaking to Russian media. So, as I say, a health warning. But the explosion reportedly took place at a bus stop near Russia's 247th Guards Airborne Assault Regiment, according to local media. And they say a suspect has been detained and taken to a nearby base for questioning. Now then, go, quite a long way east, in Kopesk, that's about 1,500 kilometres east of Moscow. Explosions were reported there, near the Plantsmass ammo factory, the ammunition plant there. This comes from independent outlet Astra. Local Governor Alexei Texler said an explosion there had killed 9 people. Now, both those come from, as I say, Russian media reported via Kyiv Independent. Neither they nor we can verify those reports, but we bring them to you. Now, reference that very big overnight strike Tuesday, Wednesday that Russia launched against Ukraine. Ukraine's Air Force now say that Russia fired 405 drones in that strike, 333 brought down. They also fired 11 Iskander-M, or the North Korean variant, the KN-23 ballistic missiles, 9 Iskander-K cruise missiles, 4 Kinzhal missiles, and 4 Kh-59 or 69 variant cruise missiles. Now, as I say, most were shot down, but 12 missiles and 55 drones did get through, hitting 26 locations. We're told today that Romania had to scramble 2 F-16 fighter jets when they thought drones were going to be heading across the Danube and into Romanian airspace. In Ukraine, the last 24 hours, virtually no movement on the ground, as in recent weeks. Russia's focus still seems to be to try to head west in the vicinity of that Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia Oblast boundaries. There are unverified reports that Ukraine has captured hundreds of Russian soldiers in the vicinity of Dobrapia, north of Pokrovsk. In the Donbass, you've got that sort of push a few weeks ago that some people got very excited about for a few days. It then stalled, and Ukraine has been slowly whittling it down since then. Well, it looks like that has now finally been closed, that whole pocket. Reports here that the last of it has been wiped out, or indeed the fighters there, Russian soldiers, captured. Last night, Ukrainian air defences intercepted 92 out of 130 drones fired across the country. Strikes across the whole of Ukraine killed 8, including Freedom TV journalists Olena Haramova and cameraman Yevhen Karamazan, who was they were driving in Kramatorsk. Freedom TV has been hit twice. Their headquarters has been destroyed twice since the start of the full-scale invasion. 70 other people injured across Ukraine yesterday. A couple more for me. The Wall Street Journal says that Donald Trump's administration decided to lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of British Storm Shadow missiles, which use US intelligence for targeting, before President Zelensky met Donald Trump last Friday. So the Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that 2 US officials close to this information said the administration had not approved any Ukrainian Storm Shadow strikes until recently, when the authority for such strikes had been moved, or was moved, from US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth to NATO SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Alexis Grinkovich. He's double-hatted as the US Commander of European Command. Now, US officials told the Wall Street Journal they expect more Storm Shadow strikes against Russia. You'll see some footage of Donald Trump denying that he had authorised Storm Shadow strikes into Russia. I mean, that is strictly, we think strictly true, but that's not answering this issue about the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal are alleging that the authority to fire has been moved from Pete Hegseth down to SACEUR, and Wall Street Journal are sticking and robustly defending their story. Now, interesting report from the Institute for the Study of War. They say the Russian Ministry of Defense has said it's going to deploy reservists to protect infrastructure in the Russian rear areas that have been hit by Ukrainian long-range drones and other strikes, which is seen as a likely precursor move to deploying reservists to combat roles in Ukraine. Business card winner, Deputy Chief of the Main Organisational and Mobilisation Director of the Russian General Staff, Vice Admiral Vladimir Szymanski, he said yesterday that reservists are going to protect energy and transport infrastructure as well as oil refineries from Ukrainian strikes. Now, reservists are civilians who sign a contract with the MOD on a voluntary basis to serve in the reserve whilst remaining in their civilian day job, only called up for certain military tasks, but they don't deploy out of the country. But Szymanski said that reservists who are employees of the places that they're going to be defending knew their facilities' vulnerabilities better, the local terrain, knew how to move around. He said such groups had successfully repelled drone strikes in the past. Now, Russia recently changed the law to allow reservists to serve outside of Russia without an official Kremlin declaration of mobilisation or a state of war. Now, that move has not been widely welcomed by reservists, as you might understand. And then to fend off any criticism, Szymanski said that new law does not mean reservists will be deployed to the war in Ukraine. However, that contradicts Russian State Duma Defense Committee chairperson Andrei Kartopolov, who said 10 days ago that the new law will allow the Kremlin to deploy reservists outside of Russian territory, and he specifically mentioned Ukraine's Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts. Now, the Institute for the Study of War say the deployment of reservists to protect critical infrastructure is likely setting the conditions to mobilise these reservists for future combat roles. They say Russia will mobilise members of the reserve on a rolling basis to sustain operations inside Ukraine. It's worth noting a number of Russian mill bloggers have complained throughout the war that Russian authorities have not only failed to protect Russian infrastructure from Ukrainian strikes, but have also been pretty steadfast in trying to deflect blame for those failures. One Russian mill blogger said that mobile fire groups without better radar coverage and more air defence systems will not be effective. So the shorthand for that is they are not going to be effective. And then finally, a bit of news that's just breaking in the last 45 minutes. 3 people have been arrested in London today under the National Security Act by detectives from Counter-Terrorism Policing London. So in a statement put out less than an hour ago, 3 men aged 48, 45 and 44 have been arrested at addresses in West and Central London on suspicion of assisting a foreign intelligence service. The country to which the alleged offences relate is Russia, the statement said. Commander Dominic Murphy, head of the counter-terrorism police in London, said, "We're seeing an increasing number of who we would describe as proxies being recruited by foreign intelligence services, and these arrests are directly related to our ongoing efforts to disrupt this type of activity. Anyone who might be contacted by and tempted into carrying out criminal activity on behalf of a foreign state here in the UK should think again. This kind of activity will be investigated, and anyone found to be involved can expect to be prosecuted, and there are potentially very serious consequences for those who are convicted." So that's happening in the last 45 minutes. We're told there are searches occurring now across London, but they've Met Police specifically in their statement named Russia. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Don. The twists and turns of this week politically show no sign of abating. Donald Trump has put the US on the warpath with Moscow, with his impulsive decision to impose sanctions and cancel the peace summit, claims former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Last night, after our broadcast, the US president announced sanctions against Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, following the collapse of that proposed meeting with Putin in Budapest, Hungary. The US is our enemy, and their talkative peacemaker has now fully embarked on the warpath with Russia, Medvedev wrote on Telegram. The decisions taken are an act of war against Russia. Now Trump has fully aligned himself with loony Europe. Now, of course, occasionally sober Dmitry Medvedev is Putin's attack dog. He can be often more bellicose, where the Kremlin has to come across as more measured. But this language is, I think, indicative, at the very least, of frustration in Moscow. These measures announced by Trump are not game-changing. The initial measures are unlikely to make much difference in the short term. But the sanctions mean that any Russian assets held by the companies in the US will also be frozen. Banks or people who deal with the two oil companies and the subsidiaries could also face sanctions. And I think even more significantly, Russian calculations will have assumed no more sanctions while they string along the Americans. This could lead to some profound reappraisals of exactly what they need to be doing over the next weeks and months, if indeed there are chances of further sanctions coming down the road. Look, these are tremendous sanctions, Trump told reporters in the Oval Office. These are very big ones that are against their two big oil companies, and we hope that they won't be on for long. We hope that the war will be settled. He then expressed his recent frustration at Putin's obstinacy. In terms of honesty, every time I speak with Putin, I have good conversations, and then they don't go anywhere. He also had this to say on the Tomahawk missile saga. The problem with the Tomahawk that a lot of people don't know is it'll be a minimum of 6 months, usually a year, to learn how to use them. They're highly complex. The only way a Tomahawk is going to be shot is if we shot it, and we're not going to do that. Now, I don't know about you, but hearing that, I have flashbacks of the German excuses not to send Taurus missiles. Trump's announcement follows the European momentum on the economic front. The EU has also swiftly announced new sanctions on Russia. That's now, I think, the 19th package, which we've been talking about recently, including a ban on the import of liquefied natural gas. And earlier today, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said he was confident European leaders would, as we reported, now move to seize at least 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets. The EU has also, interestingly, imposed new travel restrictions on Russian diplomats in the Schengen zone and prohibited another 117 ships in Russia's shadow fleet. Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, said these moves are about changing the calculus by putting more pressure on the Kremlin. He joined Trump in the White House yesterday after flying to Washington to deliver the 12-point peace plan drawn up, rather hastily, I imagine, by Europe, which Adley summarised yesterday. Rutte, fulfilling his usual role of not risking upsetting the US president, said Trump was completely right to withhold the missiles from Ukraine because even with training, they would not change the whole war. Now, as one might imagine, President Zelensky has hailed the US and EU's measures as he arrived earlier for the summit of European leaders in Brussels to discuss support. Quote from him, "The new US sanctions against Russia's oil giants are a clear signal that prolonging the war and spreading terror come at a cost. It is precisely pressure on Russia that will be effective for achieving peace, and sanctions are one of its key components. I thank the President and the entire American team for this resolute and well-targeted decision. It is a strong and much-needed message that aggression will not go unanswered. A reliable and lasting peace has no alternative." Now, one senses a slight anxiety from Moscow. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, was eager to tell reporters that plans for the summit in Hungary between Moscow and Washington were still in the process of being arranged. "The dates have not been set yet," he said, "but thorough preparation is needed before then, and that takes time." The Hungarians are also desperate not to see the summit cancelled, for obvious reasons. Orban's foreign minister posted this morning, "Bad news for the pro-war lobby and good news for those who want peace. After my meeting with Secretary Rubio, it's clear that the US has not given up on holding the Budapest Peace Summit. Preparations are ongoing, and the only question is timing, not intention." Now, that may well be true. This may all be a diplomatic smokescreen in an attempt to try and put more pressure on Moscow before a meeting takes place. It's easy to imagine the diplomatic choreography already underway to bring Putin and Trump to the table again. But until Moscow truly feels the pressure, any such meeting is unlikely to bring us closer to a ceasefire, let alone peace. More likely, it would hand the Kremlin a symbolic victory, much as Alaska did. When the optics of a handshake matter more than the outcome, the risk is that any summit goes ahead regardless, and that would, in this instance, set back Ukraine and its allies. That is why they have to go further in tightening the screws on Moscow. The decision to seize Russian state assets does mark a significant and, many would argue, necessary step in that direction. But we return to the perennial question, is it enough? But let's turn to a different subject now. We're joined in the studio once again by senior foreign correspondent here at the Telegraph, Memphis Barker, who's reporting on the sanctions package I just relayed, formed the backbone of that. But Memphis, you've also been looking into another story this week, one mentioned by Dom as the report first filtered through. This is that alleged Russian war crime in Pokrovsk, where you were pretty recently. Just remind us, what is believed to have occurred and what are the ramifications of it?
Well, you'll see in the reporting around this, there's a video clip, some drone footage taken in Pokrovsk near the railway station. And in the drone footage, there are 3 clearly lifeless civilians. All of them appear to have been shot. There's a man who's still wearing his shirt still tucked into his trousers. There's a woman who's fallen next to her bicycle, which has got a pannier on the back, strapped with a laundry bag containing some goods, and a third man fallen on his side or been shot and fallen in between the railway tracks that kind of bisect Pokrovsk. The bodies aren't so very far apart, 100, 150 metres. And according to Ukraine's 7th Air Assault Forces, these civilians were killed by a group of Russian infiltrators who had broken through the porous front lines in Pokrovsk and then carried out what they said were war crimes. The footage released by the Ukrainian volunteer Denis Christov records this really extraordinary moment where there is a 4th victim of the attack, a woman who is seen propping herself up just by the side of the road, her legs very badly wounded, and you then see a young man carrying her in his arms down the road back towards the Ukrainian forces. It's a really extraordinary moment. She has her arms around his neck, her legs kind of bobbing limply in his arms, and he kind of occasionally struggles under the weight and carries out what is potentially a life-saving rescue mission. We still don't know what's happened to the woman. You cannot really get in and out in terms of evacuation teams in Pokrovsk because that Russian drone coverage is so extensive. The story itself took another twist this morning when the Kyiv Independent published a story relaying that Ukrainian intelligence had picked up a radio intercept where a Russian commander says, don't let any civilians pass this area. Even if they've got big bags, basically just shoot them. We appear, at least in this video, to be seeing the aftermath of that order, and it looks pretty carte blanche war crimes. These are very clearly civilians, Genes, ordinary people living in Pokrovsk. Again, there are perhaps a few hundred still there, the elderly, some of them unable to move. There are also, we spoke yesterday with a Ukrainian commander of the Dovbush Hornets, is a kind of a drone unit, and he said, nowadays, really, if there is to be an evacuation, it's largely done by the military. And his unit had recently carried one out, and he described some of the civilians left there, and he was like, past a certain point, they get kind of apathetic about their own life and death. I mean, because they're facing such extreme suffering. That said, the people in the video clearly just walking about the city, when they come across one of these infiltration groups, which is very much part of how the war is fought now, but because the drone coverage is so extreme, the front line is essentially, as you will have heard, and I know Francis Farrell from the Kyiv Independent was on the pod not so long ago talking about how it has become so stretched and so thin that small groups, 3, 4, 5 people, can basically push past the Ukrainian line. This unit, this infiltration group, got maybe 1.5 miles further past the Ukrainian positions, towards right in the centre of the city, towards the railway station. Again, the Dovbush Hornets commander says it's a very complicated matter for us trying to prevent these groups, because our troops are pinned down in their dugouts by the drones, but also some of these groups will be dressed as civilians, he said. So you'll see perhaps someone on a bicycle or whatever, and Ukraine's orders are not to shoot without confirmation they are an enemy combatant, obviously not something that the Russian side appears to be adhering to. Now, when this group, however large it was, reached the Pokrovsk railway station, this is where they appear to have then started shooting the civilians, preventing them coming in the direction in line with their orders. The 7th Corps put out video footage of the Ukrainian response. So, according to them, this infiltration group was eliminated. You'll see FPV video of Russian soldiers trying to escape from a series of strikes and all themselves being killed. I mean, it certainly recalled to my mind the scenes we saw in Bucha. Obviously, the video itself doesn't record the moment of the shootings, but you have very similar scenes: bicycles, blood, civilians, and what looks like the aftermath of a war crime.
Thank you, Memphis. Has there been much reaction to this?
Well, I wouldn't say there has been huge amounts of political ramifications. You haven't seen many people citing it yet. Perhaps you'll get more following this Kyiv Independent story about the order being given to shoot civilians. I mean, to me, that speaks to two things. One of them is just the extraordinary amount of brutality being carried out on a fairly daily basis by Russia's forces. Actually, again, this Dovbush Hornets commander, when we went to him to talk about this, he said, well, this happens all the time. He said, this is just one incident that has come out in the media, but, we see this really regularly. In recent months, you've had the case of the Russian troops that took a 12-year-old girl hostage as a human shield. These incidents are happening far faster and more regularly than the media can report them. Occasionally you'll get something like this that breaks through because of the sheer kind of depravity that we see in the footage, but that's because a Ukrainian drone films it, and that drone footage is passed to a volunteer to publish. So it's certainly getting harder for the world attention to be paid as much as it was to events in Ukraine, and we'll wait and see if this does kick up a bit more of a political fuss in the coming days.
Well, thanks very much, Memphis. We'll link to your piece in the show notes, which does feature the footage blurred in the appropriate places and lots more analysis from you. I'd also add that we've also just published here at the Telegraph a compelling piece today called "The Man with the Worst Job in Ukraine," about the major who has to tell the parents of soldiers killed in the war that their son or daughter has died. We hope to do some more detail on that story in a future episode, but I just thought I would flag it now because it is an extraordinary story, and that too features video footage. But thank you very much, Memphis, for your time today. Let's go now to another area of the battlefield with former tank commander Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, welcome back. Always great to have you on the podcast. It's been a while since we've talked about the area of expertise further to your other, which is, of course, chemical weapons, and that is, as I say, tanks. Now, Around half a dozen NATO allies announced new tank purchases this year, with Sweden and the Czech Republic each buying 44 German-made Leopard main battle tanks, the Netherlands buying 46, Croatia buying as many as 50. I think Poland's bought around 180, South Korea a batch of Black Panthers, Lithuania is buying tanks for the first time ever. Why is it, Hamish, you think that they're prioritising this over new kinds of weaponry that we've talked about so often on the podcast?
Good afternoon, chaps. Thanks very much for having me on. It's timely to talk about tanks again. As you say, why are NATO allies betting on tanks, even as exploding drones are wiping them out in Ukraine? Tanks have been around for 110 years. The day after the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, a lot of people were saying, that's it, the tank is over. And ostensibly in the last 110 years, tanks haven't really changed much. Tracks, hull, turret, gun. I mean, that was a Mark IV tank in the First World War, and that is pretty much a Challenger 2, Leopard 2 in Ukraine at the moment. Just adding to your catalogue of who's buying tanks at the moment, the Germans in the last few weeks have also announced they're spending $500 million on armoured vehicles over the next couple of years. So when we talk about tanks, we're really talking about armoured warfare, and the principles of firepower, mobility and protection still sort of being the gold standard, as it were, on the battlefield. Allied to those who are buying tanks, you've illustrated, Francis, there are over a dozen European countries who, some working together, some working separately, who are developing new and next generation tanks. Just have a little bit a look about the ground that's involved in Ukraine and elsewhere. In the first Gulf War, we travelled about 300 miles in about 3.5 days. Real manoeuvre and shock action. People won't remember 2003 Op Thunder Run, which was when the Americans went right the way up through Iraq to Baghdad, 500 miles in about 5 days or so. So real shock action and manoeuvre, dislocating, completely getting behind the enemy in both cases. Now, wind forward to Ukraine, we're in a very different situation here. As you've described many times, the warfare is very static. It looks more like the trench warfare of the First World War, and certainly nothing like what we saw in the Gulf, both Gulf Wars, and even to a less extent in Afghanistan. But only a couple of weeks ago, and you guys did talk about it on the pod, one of the Russian thrusts around Petros is reported that over 300 Russian tanks were destroyed. So there is still an idea that they have utility. And I'll come back to the utility in Ukraine in a minute. A lot of people are saying, are we learning these lessons, particularly from, the British MOD? I mean, I would say absolutely we are. I mean, interesting enough, I did a video yesterday on another story that you guys have covered about the maritime drones and the latest Ukrainian drone called the Sea Baby, which was demonstrated this week, or maybe it was end of last week, by the SBU, the Ukraine Security Services who run it. This is a drone a naval drone, maritime, range of 1,500 kilometers with a payload of 2 tons, 2,000 kilograms, either sort of explosive or with weapon stations on it. Now, Ukraine doesn't have a navy, but Ukraine's quasi-navy, if you like, has completely subjugated the Great Black Sea Fleet, the Russian fleet that had to move out of Sebastopol to the far east reaches of the Black Sea. And now Ukraine pretty much has freedom of maneuver over the Black Sea. So maybe that is giving us some sort of idea of perhaps where the land war will be going. We've talked about drones, but are future tanks going to be drones as well? And on the navals, I've perhaps rather glibly suggested maybe the Royal Navy will be turned autonomous, but I'm sure the Telegraph's Navy commentator, Tom Sharp, will have something to say about that. Just on to how NATO operates. I mean, I would suggest that if NATO was operating at full scale in Ukraine, it would be operating very differently from Ukraine, not least because the pure firepower and air power and military power that NATO actually possesses, which Ukraine doesn't. And that air power and all the rest of the power does give you the ability to sort of freedom maneuver. When we look at the Strategic Defence Review, which again we discussed before, 20% of the lethality, we're all talking about, again, triple lethality in the next couple of years. 20% of it is going to come from conventional means, tanks. attack helicopters, that sort of thing. The rest of the 80% from drones. So that sort of seems like a viable option. But we talk about the threat paradigm and how it sort of shifts. Now, at the moment, tanks in Ukraine, to counter the threats of drones, we're seeing these incredible vehicles looking like tortoises and moving sheds that have been produced, because that, in a short timeline, that is what is proving effective. And tanks being used in onesies and twosies. Dom and I are used to sort of manoeuvring with squadrons of 14 tanks, or even, regiments of 50 odd tanks. Now that is just not happening because the environment in Ukraine is far too vulnerable. But when the threat paradigm catches up, and some of the stuff I've been seeing and some stuff you've been talking about, actually, it sort of changes the balance. So with some of the anti-drone capability, some of the laser turrets that are potentially going on tanks like Challenger 3 and Leopard and the next generation tanks, they have the ability to take down multiple drones with lasers. Also, some of the electronic countermeasures, when you put it all together, to me, that is then bringing the tank back into its key place of firepower, protection, and mobility. And even now we're seeing drones having to be tethered with fiber optic cables. And if you've got a drone on a fiber optic cable, it makes it rather more difficult for it to fly into hatches and other things off tanks. So when it comes to armoured warfare, the reason that NATO countries are investing in this capability is I think they can see a sort of way forward. And we're learning lots of excellent lessons from Ukraine. But Ukraine has reached a state of warfare that I think if NATO was involved, and we are all preparing potentially to have to fight the Russians, we would want to avoid getting into a static warfare that we're seeing in Ukraine. And the battle plans, I'm sure, are all about maneuver, and enabled to be able to maneuver and hold ground. You still, in the future, will need to have armoured forces to do that. So that is my take on why NATO countries are investing in tanks, and the fact that this is a 110-year-old capability. It's a little bit like Tomahawk missile that you guys have been talking about, and I've written about quite a lot in the paper. The Russians are saying these are really old bits of kit. Well, yeah, they are, but the Tomahawk missile that was fired 30 years ago is, might look the same now, but it's significantly different and uprated. I think that's the same with the tanks. As long as you can stay in front of the threat paradigm, the threat cycle, if you like, then I still think that somebody will be talking about tanks in some form, probably in the next 100 years. Over.
Well, thanks very much, Hamish, for that overview on that important subject, really, because we do keep seeing, as I say, these investments in tanks. And it was only a few years ago that people were predicting the death of the tank. But as you say, Hamish, this has been a prediction that's been going around for many, many decades. There was another story, though, that I did want to ask you about it. And that is, again, something that we've seen this week. Australia has delivered the majority of the 49 promised Abrams tanks to Ukraine as part of its $1.5 billion aid package. Can you just tell us about these specific tanks and where they're likely being used at the moment?
Yeah, these are the Abrams, the American tank, very, very capable. This is not the latest version of it, but again, it's a big tank, 60, 70 tons, 120 millimeter smoothbore gun. I think it's got a 50 cal machine gun on the turret and also a heavy machine gun coaxially mounted with the main armament as well. So pretty capable, very, very simple. That's a bit of an oxymoron, I suppose. Very, very straightforward to use. Therefore, if you know your basic tank skills, you can probably jump in an Abrams. Now, how they've been used? Well, one anticipates, as with the other sort of Western tanks, that they've very much been held back and brought forward for particular operations where they can effect their fire over sort of 3 kilometers and have an impact there. We don't know exactly where they're being deployed to, but at Batchy 49 is, that is a regiment of tanks. That is a really, really powerful capability. And I'm sure Ukraine is also looking where it can have an advantage and make progress. But, with the massive defensive lines that we've discussed at great length, it makes it hugely difficult to try and maneuver through, because where there are any weak points, one assumes that the Russian commanders have done their ground assessments and worked out where people might attack. So I expect these things will be held back and brought forward for particular operations, but again, in ones and twos rather than anything more. But 49 is a big number. So we'll sort of watch this space and see how they're used in future. But I think it's another great signal to Putin that, the Allies are still prepared to put key bits of kit in there. We're not walking away from this. And all you said earlier on, when I hear Medvedev spouting stuff, you generally know that Russia's in a bad position if he's starting to scream and shout in his usual balanced way. Over.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Memphis and Dom have had to dash off, so many stories to be working on at the moment. So it leaves me to give a huge thank you to the 400 of you who joined us at the Honourable Artillery Company last night for our live recording. It was a full house and just a really inspiring event for us, and proof enough that the notion of war fatigue one often hears is rather overstated. We recorded the entire event, and both video and audio versions of it will be available over the coming days. We'll let you know. I also wanted to thank the judges of the London Press Club, who yesterday named Ukraine the Latest their podcast of the year. An honour made all the greater by sharing the category with Sky News and Tortoise's The War Game, which is, as we've talked about on the podcast previously, a superb exploration of Western defence vulnerabilities. And it was an honour too to meet one of my journalistic heroes, the legendary photojournalist Sir Don McCullum, who's now 90 years old. And I'll be reflecting on that encounter and on my interview with former NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg in tomorrow's newsletter. As always, we include a link to that in the show notes. It's free, even for non-subscribers. It's where we can share maps, diagrams, and respond to many of the thoughtful questions you send us. So if you've written in or, say, sent me a book in recent days, do sign up. It's a way for us to stay in touch when we can't always reply directly. But Hamish, where would you like to leave listeners today?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Yeah, a slightly sombre one, I suppose, here. Those people who've been following the news today will know that Soldier F has been found not guilty of all charges related to Bloody Sunday. And I think a lot of veterans find this whole business rather mucky. I'm still an active reservist myself, so, I feel very wedded to it. My own son is at Sandhurst at the moment, and I know that Blenheim Company and all at Sandhurst are avid listeners to Ukraine the Latest. So do enjoy your defence exercise, which Dom and I will remember well, where you basically dig holes for 7 days because it's character building, but I'm sure it is character building and it is good for your mental resilience. But I think also at a time when we know that British military are deployed to help with the Gaza ceasefire, I hope that Soldier F is a reminder to our politicians that men and women of this country who stand forward to go and defend this country against terrorists and those who will do us ill, do it for the love of the nation. And, when things go wrong, like Bloody Sunday, we expect our politicians to back us up and look after us. And this has been a pretty sad story in that. So I hope it's a chance for all politicians to sort of regroup and understand, quite what the military does for this country. And 99.9% of them are absolutely doing the right thing. So it's just a reminder that, as all the stuff we talked about in Ukraine the Latest, when we have yet again, a tyrant heading west, that we really do rely on our military personnel. And it's up to our politicians to make sure they're all looked after as they should be. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.